A pair of hands shoved hard against a woman's back. She flew forward through a doorway and hit the stone floor on her knees. The great door boomed shut behind her. Laughter rang out from the other side, muffled and cruel, then boots crunching away over snow. She stayed down, shaking, her wet dress clinging to her legs. Beside her, a half-frozen dog pressed close, ribs heaving under wet matted fur. Somewhere above her, in the dark of that enormous hall, a floorboard creaked. A tall shape moved. A man with a scarred face stepped into the candlelight and looked down at her without a word. This was Lady Eleanor Whitfield, sent here as a cruel joke, dumped at the door of a man the whole county called a monster. What did the Duke do next that no one in that county ever expected? Stay with me on this one. Now here's the thing you have to understand about how she ended up on that floor. Eleanor came from a good family that had run out of money. Her father was dead. Her mother was gone the year after, and what was left of the Whitfield fortune had passed sideways into the hands of her cousins. Cassius Marsh was the eldest, a magistrate now, with a fine coat and a fine horse and a smile that never once reached his eyes. His sister Prudence trailed after him, sharp and giggling, always looking for someone smaller to step on. They kept Eleanor because it was cheaper than paying a servant. She mended their clothes. She carried their letters. She ate what they didn't want, and only when they were finished. She slept in a cold room over the stables and rose before the house to lay the fires. If a cup was chipped, it was her fault. Prudence liked to pinch quick and hard in the soft part of the arm where the bruise wouldn't show. Cassius never raised a hand himself. He didn't need to. He'd just look at her slow, the way a man looks at a horse he's deciding whether to keep or sell, and she'd feel her whole body go small. And she never once complained because she had nowhere else to go and they knew it. That's what breaks a person, if you want to know. Not the blows, the knowing. The knowing that there is no door anywhere in the world that opens for you. Then one night, half drunk after a dinner party, Cassius had an idea. He told his guests about the mad Duke up on the hill, the monster of Ravenscar. He told it well, the fire in the east wing, the dead wife, the scar. And he said, wouldn't it be a laugh to send someone up there? Someone nobody would miss. Watch him throw her out into the snow and shame her name so the whole county could talk about it for a month. Everybody laughed, and everybody looked at Eleanor. She stood by the wall with a wine jug in her hands, and she watched a room full of well-fed people decide her fate for sport, and not one of them thought of her as a person at all. That's the part she'd remember, not the cold that came after, the laughing. So they put her in a cart. No cloak, no lantern. They drove her up the frozen hill, and on the way she found a dog. A great gray wolfhound, half-starved, chained to a post someone had left him at, ribs showing through his coat. He was shivering worse than she was. And Eleanor, who owned nothing, knelt in the snow and unhooked that chain with her bare fingers, though the iron burned like ice against her skin. Cassius told her to leave the animal. He said it flat, bored, the way he said everything. She said no. It was the first time in years she'd said no to anything, and the word came out cracked and strange, like something she'd forgotten she owned. They dragged her to the door anyway, dog and all. They knocked. And when it opened a crack, they shoved her through it and ran, laughing all the way back down the hill. Which brings us back to the floor, the scarred man, and the silence. Eleanor got one arm under herself and pushed up. Her knees screamed where they'd hit the stone. But the dog, she had to think about the dog. It was here because of her, and it had pressed itself against her side like she was the only warm thing left in the world. Please, she said, and her voice cracked. Not for me, for him. He'll die out there, just let him near the fire, then I'll go, I swear I'll go. The Duke didn't answer. He walked past her. She flinched, sure a blow was coming, and hated herself for how fast the flinch came, how well her body knew that particular fear. Instead, she heard a heavy dragging sound. When she looked up, he'd pulled the iron bolt across the great oak door, locked it, sealed them both inside. Her heart went cold. Every story she'd ever heard came rushing back. He turned around. Up close his face was worse than the rumors. A wide scar ran from his jaw up across one cheek, old and pale, the skin pulled tight so that one side of his mouth never quite moved right. But his eyes weren't a monster's eyes. They were tired, careful, watching her the way you watch something that might bolt for the door and hurt itself trying. "You're not going anywhere," he said, low and quiet, "not tonight." And that was the sentence the whole county would twist for weeks. "You're not going anywhere." They'd say he'd trapped her, imprisoned her, ruined another woman behind those locked doors, but that's not what happened, not even close. Because the next thing the Duke did was crouch down beside the dog. Slow, careful. He held out one huge hand, palm up, and let the animal smell him. The wolfhound sniffed, trembled, and then pushed its cold nose right into his palm. "He's got a name?" the Duke asked, not looking at her. "I don't know it. I only found him tonight." The Duke thought for a moment. "Barrow," he said. "Look at him, built like a barrow cart and about as stubborn." And for just a second, one corner of his ruined mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but close. He carried Barrow to the fire himself, fetched a blanket, fetched broth from a kitchen that clearly hadn't cooked for guests in years. He warmed it with his own hands and crouched there while the dog drank, not rushing it, not saying a word. Then he found Elinor dry clothes, a plain wool dress that had belonged to someone once, and pointed her to a room with a lock she could work from the inside. "Bolt it if you want," he said. "The bolt's for you, not against you." She didn't understand that yet. She would. That night Elinor lay in a strange bed in a monster's house, and for the first time in 3 years nobody screamed at her, nobody struck her, nobody made her feel like something scraped off a boot. She kept waiting for it. She lay stiff under the blanket, listening for footsteps in the corridor, for the click of a latch. None came. She should have been terrified. Instead, with Barrow's warm weight snoring against the door, she slept deep, the way she hadn't slept since she was a girl in a house that still had her name on it. She woke thinking it had all been a dream and that today he'd throw her out to be laughed at. That was the plan, after all. That was the joke. But morning came and the Duke set a bowl of porridge in front of her without a word, then another on the floor for Barrow. And Elinor realized the joke had gone wrong somewhere. Terribly, wonderfully wrong. She stayed one day, then 2. She learned his name was Alistair, though it felt strange to say out loud, like using the first name of a king. She learned the hall was enormous and empty, most rooms shut up and dark. She learned he ate alone, worked alone, rode alone at dawn along the cliffs where nobody could see his face. He paid the few servants who'd stayed loyal more than he could afford because they'd stayed when everyone else fled. And she learned that everything she'd been told about him was a lie built on top of one true, terrible thing. His first wife was dead, Lady Cecilia. There had been a fire 4 years back in the East Wing. Cecilia had died in it. And Alistair had run into the flames to reach her and come out carrying nothing but the scar on his face. The county decided he'd started it. Nobody asked why a man would burn himself half to death saving a woman he'd murdered. It was simpler to have a monster on the hill. Monsters are easy. Monsters you don't have to feel sorry for, and you don't have to look too hard at whatever ugly thing is standing behind them, holding the match. On the 3rd night, Elinor found him in the library staring at a portrait covered in cloth. She asked gently if that was Cecilia. He didn't uncover it, but he talked, slow at first, then not slow at all, like a man who'd carried a stone so long he'd forgotten he was allowed to set it down. And what he told her was this. Cecilia hadn't been afraid of him. She'd been afraid of someone else. Someone who came to the hall in the weeks before she died. Someone who wanted the Ravenscar lands and thought clearing the way to them was worth anything. "I couldn't prove it," Alistair said. "The magistrate wouldn't hear it, said grief had turned my head." said I was inventing a villain to spare myself the shame of an accident. He looked into the fire. The magistrate had reasons of his own. Alina felt something cold crawl up her spine, but she didn't know why. Not yet, she should have, because Barrow did. When Alistair spoke of those weeks before the fire, the dog lifted his head off the hearth and let out a low sound, not quite a growl, at nothing Alina could see. She thought it was a dream chasing him. It wasn't a dream. It was a memory. The next few days were the closest thing to peace Alina had ever known. She opened the shutters and let light into the dead rooms, and dust rose gold in the sun. She found the kitchen garden under the snow and paced it out and planned what she'd grow come spring. Herbs by the wall, beans on the far side, as if spring belonged to her. Alistair started taking his meals with her. He started letting her see his face in daylight without turning away. Barrow followed her everywhere, a gray shadow with warm eyes, healthy now, his ribs disappearing under new weight. One evening they sat by the fire, the three of them, and Alistair read aloud, his rough voice going soft over the words, and Alina laughed at something, really laughed, from somewhere in her chest she'd thought had gone shut for good. And he looked up at the sound of it and looked at her like she was a fire he was warming his hands at. Outside the snow fell soft and quiet. The bolt was drawn on the great door. Everything was still. Everything was safe. She let herself believe it was over, that the joke had turned into the one good thing in her life, that whatever had happened in this house was buried under the snow with all the rest of the cold things. That's when Barrow lifted his head off the hearth. He rose slowly, hackles going up along his spine in a hard gray ridge, and walked to the window with a growl building deep in his chest. Not at a fox, not at the wind. At the gate, Alina went to look, and down at the end of the drive, sitting on a fine horse in the falling snow, patient as a gravestone, was a man in a fine coat with a smile that never reached his eyes. Cassius Marsh had come back, and Barrow knew him. Barrow, who'd been chained and starved and dumped like rubbish. Barrow, who had never once growled at the scarred stranger who locked the door, who'd taken broth from that stranger's hand the first night, was snarling now, teeth bared, every muscle rigid, at Alina's own cousin. That's when it stopped being a story about a monster in a house, and started being something else entirely, because Alistair went white, not at the sight of Cassius, at the sight of the dog. "Where did you find him?" he said, and his voice had gone strange and tight. "Alina, the dog, where?" "My cousin's post road, chained up." "Why?" Alistair walked to the window like a man walking to the edge of a cliff. He stared down at the animal at the glass, then at the rider at the gate, then back again. "That dog," he said slowly, "was Cecilia's. She raised him from a pup. He slept at the foot of our bed every night of our marriage. He ran from this house the night of the fire, and we searched for weeks, and we thought he was dead. For years I've thought that dog burned with her. Now, before we go on, I have to say this. If you're still with me, if this story's got its hooks in you the way it had its hooks in me, take 1 second and hit that subscribe button. It genuinely helps these stories reach more people. Now, back to the gate, back to the dog who came home. Alina's mind raced. The dog ran from the fire and turned up chained on Cassius Marsh's land. Cassius, who kept him. Cassius, who dumped him and her at Ravenscar as a joke. Cassius, who was a magistrate now. Cassius, who had ruled the fire an accident and let the county blame the Duke. "He was here," Alina whispered. "Before Cassius. He came here before the fire, didn't he?" Alistair's jaw tightened. "A young man came courting my wife's favor. Money troubles," he said. "Some thin thread of Whitfield blood that gave him a claim to sit at my table. I turned him away twice. The third time Cecilia turned him away herself in front of the servants and told him plainly what she thought of a man who'd marry a fortune to save his skin. He touched the scar on his face without noticing he did it. 2 weeks later she was dead. And I never once thought to connect a boy's wounded pride to a fire, Why would I? I didn't even remember his name. He closed his eyes. Cassius Marsh. I do now. Down at the gate, Cassius dismounted. He didn't approach. He just stood there in the snow, patient, smiling up at the lit windows. He'd come to collect his joke's punchline. He'd expected to hear that the Mad Duke threw the Whitfield girl out and ruined her name. Instead, the county was starting to whisper that she'd stayed, that she'd been seen in the village on the Duke's arm, alive and warm and laughing. That was a problem for a man like Cassius, because a woman who stayed was a woman who talked. And Elinor had heard too much. There was a hammering at the door, not Cassius. A footman he'd brought pounding with a gloved fist. Lady Elinor Whitfield, a voice called out, official and smooth. By order of her guardian and family, you are to be returned home at once. The magistrate himself has come to see it done, in person, as a mercy. Guardian, family, order, mercy. Do you hear how the nature of it changed? An hour ago the danger was a scarred man and a locked door. Now the danger wore a badge of law and called itself her protector. Now it wasn't one monster on a hill. It was the whole machinery of the county, the courts, the magistrate's word against a ruined duke's, all of it lined up to take her back to the one place she'd never survived telling the truth. Alistair looked at her. If you go with him, he said quietly, you won't reach the bottom of the hill alive. You know that now. You're the only one besides me who's put it together, and you've got the one witness that can't be talked away standing right here growling at him. And I'm the monster nobody believes. Elinor understood. The locked door had never been her prison. From the first night, it had been the only wall standing between her and the man now smiling at the gate. Then don't open it, she said. Alistair almost smiled. I wasn't going to. But Cassius Marsh had not built a life out of being told no. When the pounding brought nothing, he tried the smooth voice himself, close against the wood. Thorne, old friend, I only want the girl. She's my ward, my blood, my responsibility. Hand her over and there's no trouble, no talk. Keep her and I'll have 30 men and a warrant up this hill by morning. I'll say you took her. I'll say you locked her up, same as the last one. A pause, and you could hear the smile in it. Who do you think they'll believe? You with that face, or the magistrate? And there it was. The whole trap laid bare. Cassius could take Elinor by force of law or destroy Alistair by force of rumor, and either way he won. Either way the truth about that fire died in the snow. Elinor felt the old fear rising, the fear that had kept her silent and small for 3 years, the fear that told her to make herself little and let the powerful people decide. And then she felt Barrow lean warm against her leg, solid as a wall, and she remembered kneeling in the snow to unchain him because it was the first time she'd ever said no. He's going to send the men either way, she said. So we don't wait for morning, we don't run and we don't hide. We make sure that by morning, everyone knows the truth. Alistair frowned. How? His word is law here. Mine is worth less than the mud on his boots. Not against her. She turned to him and the plan came all at once whole. Cecilia, did she keep letters? A woman who was afraid of a man who shamed him in front of the servants and knew he'd taken it badly. She wouldn't have just sat with it. She'd have told someone, on paper, somewhere in this house. Alistair went still. Then he ran, not to the door, up the great stairs 2 at a time to the shut-up east wing that hadn't been touched since the fire. Elinor followed with a candle, her hand cupped around the flame, Barrow bounding ahead of them both. And it was Barrow who led. Down the burned corridor, past the black timbers and the smell of old smoke, to a door swollen shut in its frame. He scratched at it and whined, high and desperate, the way a dog whines at a door he used to sleep behind. Alistair put his shoulder to it and it gave. Inside was Cecilia's writing room. Half burned, the plaster black, the window gone, but the desk scorched and standing. And in a drawer with a false bottom that Alistair, in 4 years of grief, had never been able to make himself search, was a bundle of letters tied in ribbon, in Cecilia's hand, dated the weeks before her death. Alina read them by candlelight while fists hammered the great door below, and the truth came out of the dead woman's own pen. Cassius Marsh had threatened her, had told her that if she turned him away again, he'd see to it there was nothing left to inherit and no husband left to keep it from him. She'd named the date he last came. She'd written that his eyes frightened her more than any raised voice ever had, that he'd made an ugly little joke about fire and laughed at his own wit. She'd written that she'd begun sleeping with the dog by the door because the dog didn't like him, and she trusted the dog's judgment over her own manners. And in the last letter, that she was done being afraid, that she was going to tell her husband everything in the morning and let him deal with the coward at the gate. She never got the morning. He killed her, Alastair said. His voice shook, not with grief now, with rage, 4 years old, finally given somewhere to go. He killed her and let me carry it. He let me carry her out of that fire and burn my own face doing it, and then stood up in his own courtroom and let the whole world call me the one who lit the match. Below them the hammering stopped. That was worse than the noise. In the silence, Alina heard the crack of splintering wood and knew Cassius had lost his patience with the law and gone back to what he did best. They were breaking the door. He can't let those letters leave this house, Alina said. That's why he's really here, not for me, for anything Cecilia might have left behind. That's why he came himself tonight instead of sending men. Alastair pushed the letters into her hands, folding her fingers around them. Then they leave with you, the cliff path off the east wing. It's narrow and bad in the snow, but it comes out below the gate, past his men, and they won't know it's there. Take Barrow, get to the vicar in the village. He's an honest man, the one honest man in 10 miles. Put the letters in his hands and it's done. My word won't beat the magistrate's, but hers will. A dead woman's in her own hand is a thing no court can pretend it never heard. And you? I'll open the door, he said, and smiled all the way this time, scar and all. He wants the monster. I'll give him a few minutes of monster. Alina didn't want to leave him. Everything in her fought it. But she understood now that some doors you lock to keep danger out, and some you open to hold it in place. And there is a kind of courage that looks exactly like walking away. She kissed him, quick and fierce, the first and she feared the last time, and then she was gone with the dog into the cold, out through the broken window and onto the cliff path where the wind took her breath and the sea roared black below. The great oak door came down in a shower of splinters, and Cassius Marsh stepped into Ravenscar Hall for the second time in his life, 3 men behind him with cudgels. He found the Duke standing alone at the foot of the stairs, unarmed, calm, waiting. "Where is she?" Cassius said. "Gone," said Alastair, and she took the truth with her, everything Cecilia wrote. Everything you hoped had burned. Cassius's smile finally slipped. He understood in one heartbeat exactly what had been found and where it was going. "Get her," he snapped at his men. "The girl and the dog, bring me whatever she's carrying." 2 of them ran for the drive, and Cassius drew a pistol from his coat and pointed it at the Duke, because a scarred monster found dead in the house where a woman went missing was a story the county would swallow whole, the way it had swallowed all his stories before. But here's what Cassius Marsh forgot. He forgot the cliff path was steep, and the snow was deep, and his men were town men in fine boots who'd never walked a night like this in their lives. And he forgot, most of all, about the dog. Barrow heard the men crashing down through the drifts behind Alina. He turned, and the starved, chained, dumped animal who had lost his mistress to this man's fire planted himself in the narrow path, a gray wall of teeth, the growl coming up out of him like something 4 years in the building. 1 man swung a cudgel. Barrow took it on the shoulder and drove him off the path into the dark with a scream that the wind swallowed whole. The second man saw the first go over the edge and stopped dead and would not take another step, not for Cassius Marsh, not for any wage on earth. Eleanor kept running. The letters stayed dry against her chest. Back in the hall, Cassius heard the scream from the cliff and knew he'd lost. His whole life had rested on one thing, the county believing his word over everyone's. Once those letters reached one honest man, the word of a magistrate was worth nothing at all. He'd hang. And a hanging man had nothing left to lose. He steadied the pistol at the Duke's chest. Then I'll have the one thing I can still take, the last person who read those letters. His finger tightened. And Alistair Thorne, who had run into fire once and lost, ran into it again. He came off that bottom stair faster than a big man should move. The pistol went off, deafening in the stone hall, the ball tearing across the outside of his arm. And then his hands were on Cassius Marsh, and 4 years of a monster's grief came down on a murderer all at once. He didn't kill him. Later Eleanor would be glad of that, glad the man lived to hang for what he'd done rather than die quick and easy on a floor. Alistair pinned him and held him, bleeding, until the fight went out of him entirely, and Cassius Marsh lay still under the weight of the man he'd tried to destroy, weeping, because the smiling had never once reached his eyes, but the fear finally did. Eleanor reached the village before midnight. She put the letters in the vicar's hands and told him everything, breathless, soaked through, a wolfhound bleeding at her side. The vicar read 3 lines by candlelight and reached for his coat and his horse without a word. An honest man is a slow thing to move and an impossible thing to stop. By morning, it wasn't 30 of Cassius Marsh's men coming up the hill. It was the county. The real county, the one that had whispered about a monster for 4 years and now had a dead woman's own words read aloud in the churchyard for anyone to hear. They came up to Ravenscar, and they found no monster at all. They found a wounded duke and a bound magistrate, and a bundle of letters that turned every story they'd ever told about that house inside out. Cassius Marsh was tried in the spring, not by his own bench. By men who'd finally read Cecilia's letters and looked at the scar on the Duke's face and understood, at last, what kind of man burns himself half to death for a woman. Prudence, his sister, swore she'd known nothing, and maybe that was even true. Cassius said nothing in his own defense that anyone believed. He'd traded on his word too long, and his word was gone. They hanged him for murder before the apple trees flowered, and Ravenscar Hall, that shut-up tomb of a place, came slowly back to life. Eleanor didn't leave. There was no joke left to be the punchline of, no family left to return to, and no reason on earth she'd have gone anyway. She opened the shutters she'd started opening that first week. She planted the kitchen garden she'd dreamed up under the snow, herbs by the wall, beans on the far side, exactly as she'd paced it out. The dust sheets came off the furniture. The dead rooms filled with light and, eventually, with people again, because a house whose master is no longer a monster is a house neighbors will call on. They married in the summer, quietly, in the village church where the letters had been read. Alistair wore no coat to hide his face and turned away from no one. Eleanor had spent 3 years being made small, and she never once let herself be made small again, and he loved her exactly for the part of her that refused it. The county that had shoved her up the hill as a cruelty came down the same road as guests, hats in hand, and Eleanor served them tea and forgave the ones who deserved it and remembered clearly the ones who didn't. Barrow's shoulder healed. He grew fat and gray and slow by the fire, and he never left Eleanor's side, and he never once growled at anyone who came through the gate again, because the one man he'd been growling at was gone from the world. And the great oak door. Alistair had a new bolt made, iron heavy, the twin of the old one. But he hung it and never drew it, because he'd finally learned the thing Eleanor learned her first night on that cold stone floor. A locked door isn't the story. What matters is who you're keeping out, and who you're holding close, and why. Years later, a child of theirs asked how they met, and Alina thought about the hands on her back, the door booming shut, the scarred man in the candlelight who bolted the world outside and told her she wasn't going anywhere. "I was sent here as a joke," she said, "by people who wanted to hurt me, and your father took one look at me and a half-frozen dog and he locked the door." She smiled. "It was the kindest thing anyone had ever done for me. I just didn't know it yet." That's the thing about the cruelest joke ever played on Lady Alina Whitfield. It sent her to the one door in all of England that would ever truly be opened for her. And behind it, a monster who was never a monster, and a scar that was never shame, only proof of how far a good man will run into the fire for someone he loves. The people who threw her through that door meant to end her. Instead, they carried her home. That lands at about 4,990 words. I cut roughly 340 words by trimming redundant clauses and doubled-up sensory beats. The setups repeated chores, the "as if she'd still be there in spring" echo, and small connective phrases in the letters and escape sequences. Every beat you named is intact. The joke, the dog rescue, the bolt, Barrow's naming, the Falscombe Nights, Cecilia's fire, the growl at the gate trigger, the CTA, the Lawtrap escalation, the letters, the cliff fight, Cassius subdued for the noose, the vicar, the trial, and the full resolution through the child's question and the closing 2 lines.